Darren thought she'd be like the others, nervous, unsure, easily silenced with a warning or a ticket. He'd gotten away with it before. A little bluffing, a few questions with that official tone, and most people wouldn't think twice. But that night, things didn't go the way he expected. That night, Captain Juliana Reyes didn't just stand her ground. She exposed everything he had built his career on and tore it down one precise fact at a time. Outside Albuquerque, the highway lay quiet, the kind of emptiness only found late at night when even the truckers had found a place to stop. The few cars that passed were just smudges of light, briefly reflected off the slick pavement where an early fall rain had passed through. The glow from the nearby street lamps stretched out in elongated streaks along the shoulder near the edge of town, giving everything a hazy, orange tint. It was almost midnight. For the last 2 hours, Juliana had been driving steadily, logging miles more out of habit than urgency. Her fingers tapped lightly on the steering wheel, keeping time with a soft Coltrane tune drifting from her speakers. She wore a plain navy pullover and jeans, her dark hair pulled back tightly, not for appearances, but for practicality. There was nothing about her to suggest she held a commanding position in the US Navy. She looked like any other woman heading home after a long day, and that was precisely why Darren picked her. As soon as the red and blue lights lit up behind her, she caught sight of them in the mirror. They weren't far, coming up fast. Her jaw tightened slightly, not in fear, but in that quiet, tired resignation that comes from recognizing a familiar script. She knew the drill: signal, pull over, stop completely, hands on the wheel, no sudden movements, one deep breath in. She'd done this before, maybe not often, but enough times to know what could go wrong. Juliana rolled the window down just as the officer approached. She didn't speak first. She never did. She let him take the lead, and as he began, she immediately sensed the tone. Not protective, not procedural. It was something else, something she had seen in men like him. Entitled, careless, and sure he could bend the rules. But this time, he was wrong. This time, he had pulled over the wrong woman. Juliana knew exactly how these encounters were supposed to go. Years in the service had drilled it into her. Step-by-step protocol, what to say, how to say it, how to remain composed even when everything felt tilted. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. Behind her, the white patrol cruiser came to a stop. Its headlights cast thin beams into her rear window, reflecting off the rearview mirror like small spotlights. She kept her hands where they were, right on the wheel, fingers relaxed, but steady. It took the officer a full minute before he stepped out. She heard his door open, the muffled click as it swung shut behind him, then measured footsteps on the damp asphalt. He wasn't in a hurry. He was taking his time, each step like punctuation. She caught sight of him in her side mirror, tall, stocky, walking with the kind of confidence built on years of not being questioned. His hand rested easily on his belt, grazing the edges of his holster, while the other hand held a flashlight. He pointed the beam straight at her face before angling it down, as if reassessing her worth based on her reaction. His name tag caught the light just as he stopped by her window, Darren Slater. "License and registration," he said, without even a nod. No greeting, no small talk. His voice was clipped and empty, like this was something he'd done 1,000 times and didn't plan to make interesting. Juliana met his eyes in the mirror for a second, then slowly reached over to her glove box and handed him her paperwork. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked quietly but directly. Slater didn't answer right away. He took her license and registration without looking at her, held them just far enough so she couldn't see them clearly anymore, and shifted his body slightly to run a glance over her car. "Your tail lights are out," he said. Juliana instinctively frowned, a tiny movement, not one of aggression but of skepticism. "That seems unlikely," she replied. Her car had gone through inspection less than a week before. That made... Him finally meet her eyes, his flashlight now held loosely down by his side. "Are you contradicting me?" he asked, an edge creeping into his voice. There was a pause, not long, just long enough for a shift, the kind where one person expects obedience and the other decides they're not going to play along. Juliana had been through enough conflict zones to recognize how power played out in small, quiet moments, not just on battlefields or during operations. Back in Norfolk during her pre-deployment briefings, scenarios like this were broken down in detail. They were taught to operate under strict protocols when stationed among civilians, and just as importantly, they were trained on how to respond when they became the civilians, especially in encounters involving local law enforcement. She knew not to escalate, but she also knew the law, and she knew herself. "I'm simply stating," she said evenly, keeping her voice measured, "that my lights were checked just a few days ago during service, but sure, if something changed, I'll have it repaired." Slater didn't react to her words. Instead, he cut her off mid-sentence. "Exit the vehicle," he said, flat and cold, like someone hitting a switch. Juliana felt a small wave of frustration, but swallowed it quickly. She took a slow breath, silently counting to 3. The road around her was still too quiet, just a distant set of headlights far down the highway. If anyone had been behind her before, they'd already driven past. No cameras, no cell phones pointing her way. Her fingers tapped once, only once, against the steering wheel. Then she reached for the door handle. "May I ask," she said, keeping her eyes on him, "why that's necessary?" Slater cocked his head slightly and gave a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because I instructed you to." Juliana didn't answer right away. She let the silence fill the space between them, pushing it just long enough without crossing over into outright refusal. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. The air hit her first, cool, almost sharp. She stood upright, neither tense nor slack, just present. It was something she'd practiced 100 times on bases across the country, posture that read respectful but not helpless. She noticed right away how he backed up slightly, taking in her full height, the calm way she moved. His eyes flickered briefly, probably recalibrating. That was the thing about power. It adjusted itself the second it felt the ground shift. "Turn around," he said, his voice firmer now. "Place your hands on the vehicle." She didn't flinch, and she sure as hell didn't look away. Juliana didn't move. The asphalt beneath her boots felt solid, but the space around her suddenly felt tighter. The quiet highway, the lack of witnesses, the way Officer Slater's tone had shifted, everything had changed in a heartbeat. She kept her eye contact steady and asked, "On what grounds?" That set something off. Slater stepped closer. The smirk he wore earlier dropped like a mask. His voice lost its fake calm, sharpening with irritation. "Are you refusing to comply?" he asked, his hand not far from his belt again. "No," Juliana said, still firm. "I'm requesting clarification." Her posture hadn't changed, but her mind was racing through scenarios. The few streetlights overhead buzzed softly, their glow doing little to push back the shadows around them. She could see it in his face. He wasn't used to being questioned on the side of the road. Not like this. Not by someone who obviously wasn't afraid. Slater stared for another few seconds, then reached for the radio, clipped to his chest. "I've got an uncooperative motorist here," he muttered into it, like he was documenting her pushback. A second later, louder and with more force, "Turn around now." Juliana's heart picked up speed, but she made sure it didn't show. She'd practiced this restraint more times than she could count. She kept her chin steady and said calmly, "Officer, I need to make something clear. I'm fully aware of my legal rights and of the limits to your authority." That pushed him, his jaw clenched so hard she could almost hear it grind. In one movement, he reached for her arm. "You're under arrest," he said, voice rising. Turn around. Juliana shifted back just a step, a small enough movement to dodge his reach, but enough to make her point. Arrested for what exactly? She asked. Slater didn't answer. He just pulled out his cuffs like it was routine. For interfering with an officer, he snapped. She exhaled through her nose, not loudly, but sharp enough to release the tension just under the surface. There it was. The playbook move when control starts to slip. Create a charge, shift the narrative, make it about compliance instead of behavior. Juliana's training kicked in like muscle memory. Keep calm, breathe, record every detail in your mind. Submit now, speak later. She straightened her shoulders and, without backing away, turned around slowly and placed her hands on the hood of her car. She chose her line in that moment. Not weakness, not surrender, just survival. She wasn't giving him power. She was choosing a smarter way to fight. Juliana turned slowly, not out of fear or hesitation, but with the kind of control that tells someone they're not the one truly in. Charge! She raised her hands and pressed them flat against the roof of her car. The metal felt cold and steady, like she imagined herself to be in that moment. Before she could adjust her stance, Slater grabbed one of her arms with more force than necessary and yanked it behind her. His grip was rough, and the handcuffs bit down tight on her wrists before she had a chance to say anything. He shoved her a step forward, the pressure making her stumble slightly. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice low and even, with no edge, just truth. He gave a short, smug laugh. "Lady, I know precisely what I'm doing." But he didn't, not even close. Juliana didn't resist when he guided her, still cuffed, toward his patrol car. The back door swung open and he pushed her in, not bothering with small talk or warnings. The plastic bench wasn't designed with comfort in mind. It was stiff, and it pushed awkwardly into her back as she shifted to stay balanced. The metal cuffs around her wrists hadn't loosened, not one bit. If anything, they'd gotten worse. Then came the hard slam of the door, and just like that, she was sealed in. Outside, she saw him through the tinted glass. Slater walked back toward the front seat of his cruiser, talking quietly into his radio. His expression looked relaxed, too relaxed for someone who had just escalated a routine stop into an arrest. She couldn't hear his exact words anymore, just the occasional crackle from his mic. Juliana leaned back carefully into the seat, aware of every pressure point against her spine. Her eyes settled on the divider in front of her. It reflected a faint version of her face, enough that she could see herself looking almost too calm. But inside, something was shifting. Beneath that surface, frustration, focus, and memory, all the pieces she'd learned in years of service, coiled together like a spring. She shifted her hands a little, careful not to give a show of discomfort, but the sharpness around her wrists made it clear. He hadn't just cuffed her tightly, he'd done it on purpose. A message. Juliana stared ahead. He thought she'd been silenced. He couldn't have been more wrong. The front driver's door swung open with a creak, and Officer Darren Slater dropped into the seat like he had all the time in the world. One hand moved lazily to start the engine, while the other pulled the seatbelt across his chest. "Well, well," he said, almost amused with himself. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Juliana in the back. "Let's take a drive." She didn't bother answering. The cuffs still pressed hard into her wrists, and shifting around only made them worse. Instead, she focused on her breathing and the flashing colors reflecting off the side windows. Red and blue lit up the dark pavement behind them like bleeding ink. Slater flicked the turn signal and steered the car back onto the road. The cruiser rolled forward with a jolt, emergency lights still spinning even though there was no emergency. Traffic was light, but not absent. A few cars passed in the opposite direction, their drivers probably ignoring the lights, assuming it was just another routine stop. "You know," Slater said after a few minutes, like he couldn't help himself, Most folks just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to get out of the car. Juliana let out a quiet breath through her nose. And most officers don't arrest people for asking why they've been pulled over. He laughed, loud, full of himself. Lady, you clearly think you're someone important. Without missing a beat, she looked at him through the divider. Her voice was steady. I don't think. I know. That landed. Just for a second, his hands stiffened on the steering wheel and his grip tightened like he was holding back something more. He didn't reply immediately, trying instead to hide whatever had flickered across his face. Military, aren't you? He asked casually now, but the edge was still there. Can always spot the type. Juliana said nothing. Yeah, he continued, his voice lower. You've got that attitude, like you're above the rules. Bet you figured I'd back down, if you flashed that rank around. Still, she stayed quiet. The way he was talking told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about a busted taillight. This was about power, ego, and what happened when someone pushed back. No threats, no negotiations, just a long, steady recording of every word he said, for later. Slater clicked his tongue, dragging out the moment like a bad performance. Too bad, he muttered, as if she had ruined a perfectly good evening. If you'd just cooperated, we could have avoided all this mess. Juliana didn't answer. Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, biting back everything she wanted to say. It wasn't the time for that. He wanted a reaction, wanted to frame the whole thing like it was her fault. That classic move that people like him leaned on when they knew they were already in the wrong. Apo. Ahead, the station came into view. It was a squat, plain grey building tucked just off the main road, half hidden behind some tall hedges. Nothing about it stood out, but Juliana knew the place would be under bright lights inside, full of humming. Computers and half-bored officers waiting out the last few hours of their shift. The parking lot was mostly empty, which made sense. Late-night arrests didn't move fast. There was no rush, no urgency. This time of night, they took their time. And right now, it looked like she was the only one coming through those doors. Slater pulled into a marked spot close to the entrance, killing the engine with a flick of his wrist. He didn't speak right away. He just looked over his shoulder at her through the divider. I'll admit, he said, tone too casual for the circumstances, I like when they don't put up too much of a fight. Makes my job simpler. Before she could say anything, he was already outside. She heard the door slam, loud and final. A few seconds later, her own door opened and his voice, colder now, said, Move. Juliana didn't hesitate. She slid out carefully, her shoulders square, ignoring the burning sting in her wrists. The cuffs hadn't loosened at all. If anything, they dug in deeper during the drive. She caught her balance and followed him toward the building. Eyes, straight ahead, no emotion on her face. The desk officer barely looked up as they passed. A quick nod, nothing more. Business as usual. Inside the holding area, the air was damp and stale, thick with the scent of old coffee and sweat. A metal bench ran along one wall, and near its end, the steel door to the cells waited, silent, closed, and cold. Officer Darren Slater finally removed the handcuffs, but only briefly, just enough to walk Juliana through the standard booking process. Her wrists throbbed the moment the metal loosened, deep red lines already etched into her skin. She didn't flinch. The desk officers barely looked up from their screens as they fingerprinted her and took a mugshot. Same expressionless faces, same robotic attention to procedure. No one asked questions. No one made eye contact. It was the passive kind of silence that spoke volumes. She'd seen it before, in places far from Alabama, during deployments where silence protected rank more than it ever protected integrity. She stood quietly as the final entry was completed on the terminal, and Slater reappeared, grabbing her wrist again, as if she was some kind of flight risk. His hand gripped tighter this time, like he wanted to make a point without saying it out loud. "Think you're clever, don't you?" he said under his breath, almost like he couldn't stand the quiet anymore. Juliana turned her head slightly, toward him, giving no more than a glance. "I don't need to think about it." She didn't raise her voice, didn't smile, but the way she said it, it hit. Slater's jaw tightened, and his fingers clamped down harder, if only for a second. She knew exactly what that comment did to him, and maybe part of her wanted that. He walked her through one more narrow door, this one heavier and more worn. The back hallway was dim, lit by flickering fluorescent lights, and reeked of mildew and strong disinfectant. At the end of the hall sat a line of holding cells, all empty except one. He paused in front of the open door and gave a little sneer. "Enjoy your stay," he said, giving her a small shove through. Juliana caught herself quickly, refusing to stumble. Some part of her wanted to turn and say more, but she didn't. She just watched as he smirked, tapped the bars for effect like this was some show, then turned around and walked off. A loud metallic click sealed the cell behind her. She stood still for a moment, her breath steady. Then she sat down on the bench across from the bars. The cold cut through her jeans, anchoring her in reality. All she needed was one night, just one. Because Officer Darren Slater had no clue, not even a sliver of the storm he had just signed up for. The bench pressed stiffly against Juliana's back, its metal surface offering no comfort and no warmth. She shifted slightly, rolling one shoulder at a time to stretch the muscles that had started to ache. The air in the cell, if she could even call it that, reeked of bleach and sweat. Two smells that shouldn't ever mix, but often did in places like this. The walls were plain, dull grey, and the single light overhead flickered every so often, casting short, tired shadows across the floor. There was no clock, no window, just the question of how many hours she had left sitting in this box. This wasn't the worst place she'd spent the night, not even close. There had been deployments where she'd slept in muddy trenches, in storm-battered tents, and on concrete floors surrounded by complete silence, except for the knowledge that danger was only a few feet away. But still, this felt personal, not because of the cell or the cold or the smell. It was what landed her here that sat heavy on her chest. The injustice of it. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened. The voices out at the desk drifted through the hallway, muffled bits of conversation, the shuffling of paperwork, the soft clink of a coffee mug meeting a counter. Normal sounds, but they felt somehow distant to her now, like they belonged to some parallel world outside of the bars. She inhaled slowly, deep through her nose, and exhaled in full. Same pattern she'd learned in basic, taught again and again. If you control your breathing, you control your thoughts. It worked even now. Let the anger settle, don't lose focus. There was still a bigger picture here, and she knew it. Then a shift, the kind that made instinct kick in before thought. Heavy footsteps were coming down the hall, a steady, confident pace. She knew that walk. Darren Slater wasn't even trying. To be subtle. That same rhythm in his step gave him away, like somebody who thought the whole building answered to him. Juliana didn't get up. She didn't even look toward the bars yet. She just let the weight of her body settle back into the bench, every movement calm, deliberate. The game hadn't ended. It was just getting started. He stood in front of the cell a few seconds later, arms crossed, his weight resting on one leg like he had nowhere else to be. That smug grin still clung to his face, the same one he'd worn from the moment he slapped those cuffs on her. "Comfortable?" he asked, tilting his head like he was genuinely curious. Juliana didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. He stepped closer to the bars, hands still tucked against his chest. "You realize, if you just followed instructions, you wouldn't be here right now." Her eyes met his, steady. Then slowly the smallest smile crept across her face, not because she found him amusing, but because the situation had begun to tilt. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." The shift in him was slight, but it was there. His posture stiffened just a little. For a second, the grin faltered, and something passed behind his eyes. It might have been annoyance, maybe even hesitation, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. He scoffed and looked around the room as if expecting a cheer from an invisible audience. "Nobody's coming for you tonight, lady," he said, giving a lazy shrug. "Guess that means you'll have plenty of time to think about your attitude." She didn't react, just sat there watching him, unbothered, not flinching, and that quiet, steady stare seemed to agitate him more than any yell ever could. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping a notch. "See, here's what you don't get," he said, the words slower now, as if he was lecturing a kid who refused to learn. "People like you walk around acting like the rules don't apply. You think just because you got some confidence, a service record, maybe a title, that you're untouchable." Juliana still didn't interrupt. She let him talk, let him dig. Then, like a perfectly timed cue, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Another officer appeared from around the corner, a younger man, maybe late 20s, brown hair, buzzed short under his hat. He wore the department's navy blue uniform, clipboard tucked under one arm, and stopped a few feet from them. Sergeant?" the younger officer said, looking a little unsure. Slater barely turned. "What?" "We got a call," the younger officer said, clearer now. "You're gonna want to hear this." The younger officer shifted his clipboard from one hand to the other, clearly uncomfortable. "I think you should look at this," he said, holding it out toward Sergeant Slater. His tone was calm, but he glanced toward the holding cell, like he knew this was going to stir something up. Slater narrowed his eyes, paused for a second, then gave Juliana one last look before walking over. She didn't move, just leaned back, on the bench, letting the sounds reach her at their own pace. The hallway wasn't that far from the cell, and in between the buzz of the flickering ceiling light, she could catch parts of the conversation. The younger officer mentioned representation, legal, official, serious. Then something about a call from a federal office, a superior command. She couldn't make out every word, but it wasn't hard to piece together the tone. Someone higher up had heard about her arrest, and they weren't happy. Slater's voice dropped, real quiet, but even softened. She could hear the frustration threading through it. Short replies, clipped words. The younger man replied quickly, nervously, stumbling a little as he tried to explain. Whatever he said didn't seem to help. Juliana imagined the clipboard being handed off, then returned. Papers scanned but not really read, words heard but not accepted. Slater had walked into this thinking he held the cards. That confidence was crumbling fast. Then came the footsteps again, faster this time and louder. Slater rounded the corner with clenched fists and a tight jaw. No more smiling. His eyes held none of that smug look anymore. He stopped at the bars, not even looking around first. "What exactly did you do?" he barked. Juliana leaned forward gradually, her elbows resting on her knees. She tilted her head and spoke slow. "Me? I didn't do anything." A beat passed. Then she added, "But word travels, and some of us keep in touch with people who can pick up a phone and ask real questions." His face gave it away immediately, that brief second where realization hit him like a slap. He didn't respond, just stood there, breathing harder than the situation called for. Then, muttering something under his breath, he turned and walked off, disappearing back down the hallway. And this time, she didn't bother watching him go. Juliana let out a steady breath, her chest rising and falling with calm purpose. She knew the wait now wouldn't be long. Everything had shifted overnight, and soon all the bluster and cruelty Sergeant Darren Slater had wrapped himself in would fall apart in real time. He had no idea how deep the hole he was standing in really went, but he was about to find out. The courthouse had that formal quiet, polished floors, high ceilings, and sunbeams cutting clean lines across everything through the narrow windows up high. The morning light had a sharpness to it, bright but cold, like it hadn't warmed up to the day yet. Juliana stood comfortably near the defense table, no cuffs, no orange jumpsuit, nothing left of last night except what she carried in memory. Now she wore a midnight blue blazer, fitted and clean, paired with a white blouse. Simple, direct, nothing flashy, but nothing soft either. She wasn't trying to look impressive. She just was. The presence she held in uniform hadn't gone away. It was still there, even in civilian clothes. Next to her, Dana Polk, her attorney, flipped through court files like she wasn't in a hurry, but things still had to be exact. Dana said very little, nodding quietly to herself, double-checking notations with the kind of precision Juliana respected. No wasted movements, no rambling, just focus. They hadn't needed to talk much over the past hour. Everything had been prepared. Sudden creak of heavy hinges pulled Juliana's gaze toward the entrance. Darren Slater stepped inside the courtroom. His uniform was pressed, his chin lifted just enough to suggest control, but the walk told a different story. There was tightness in how he moved, his stride not quite as wide. His eyes scanned the space a little too quickly, landing on Juliana, before darting away again. He didn't falter completely, but the edge of his confidence had worn uneven overnight. His expression didn't hide it well. There was no smirk now, just a set jaw and a little too much tension around the eyes. Juliana didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply stood there, calm and ready, knowing that this time the courtroom wasn't a place where people like him got to make the rules and bend them. This time, everything would be seen in daylight. Whatever confidence Sergeant Darren Slater had walked in with was gone now. It showed in the way he couldn't keep his eyes on Juliana. She caught him looking once, just a flicker of a glance. And the moment their eyes met, he looked away like the floor had suddenly become more interesting than anything else in the room. That told her everything she needed to know. A minute later, the side door opened and the room fell quiet. Judge Franklin Harmon stepped up to the bench, moving at a measured pace, his face worn from decades of long hearings and longer decisions. He adjusted his glasses as he sat, and without wasting time, dove right in. "All right," he said, voice a little heavy but clear. He skimmed quickly through the pages in front of him. "Let's begin." The prosecutor stood, placing both hands on the table as he addressed the court. His name was Thomas Beale, mid-50s, clean-shaven, suit pressed without a wrinkle. He cleared his throat, his voice steady and direct. "Your Honor, we believe the defendant, Ms. Juliana Reed, was subjected to an unlawful detention. No valid cause, no proper justification. And more importantly, we've uncovered new documentation supporting a larger problem, a pattern of misconduct by the arresting officer, Sergeant Darren Slater." That last part stirred something in the gallery. A wave of murmurs rippled through the small crowd, rising just enough to draw a glance from the judge. Slater braced his hands on the back of a chair, shifting on his feet. His jaw was set tight, and when the judge finally looked up at him over the rims of his glasses, the silence returned hard. "Sergeant Slater," Judge Harmon said, "please explain your justification for the arrest." Slater straightened, his voice hesitant but slightly defensive. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine stop. She refused to comply." But Thomas Beale interrupted, not raising his voice, but not letting the moment slip. "Uncooperative," he said sharply. Ms. Reed's record includes over 15 years of service, top honors from the Naval Academy, several commendations for leadership, and not a single criminal violation on or off duty. And you're arguing that she posed enough of a risk to justify booking her on the spot over a questionable traffic violation? The room went still again. All eyes moved back to Slater, and this time even he couldn't fake control. Slater opened his mouth as if to fire back, but nothing came out. His jaw tensed. Then he closed it again, his lips pressed together tight as if words stuck somewhere. Between his throat and pride, the silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Prosecutor Beale didn't waste the moment. He kept flipping through his folder, his voice calm but full of weight. "In addition," he said, holding up a highlighted report, "a review of your department's own data shows your traffic stops disproportionately target drivers of color, specifically in regions under your regular patrol." The tension in the courtroom tightened like a rope pulling on both ends. People leaned forward in their seats. More murmurs started up, louder this time. And Judge Harmon didn't try to quiet them right away. Slater shifted on his feet again, jaw clenched, shoulders locked. His face darkened. He glanced briefly at Juliana, then looked back toward the bench as the judge slowly set the file down with a long, tired sigh. "Sergeant," Judge Harmon said, folding his hands over the small stack of notes in front of him, "these are serious allegations and I don't take them lightly." Slater crossed his arms, leaning back slightly as if trying to put distance between himself and the whole situation. "She resisted," he muttered. Beale raised one eyebrow. "Actually, according to the footage your own department submitted, she did not. Her posture remained calm. She complied with all instructions." The room stirred again. Everyone had seen this dance before, except this time the usual moves weren't working. Slater turned a bit toward the judge again, a note of desperation slipping into his voice. "I followed department guidelines." The judge gave a small shake of his head and turned to the court officer. "Let's see the footage." A screen dropped from a panel near the front. The video rolled. The courtroom watched in silence. Slater stood by the driver's window issuing sharp commands, while Juliana remained clear but polite, never raising her voice, never moving aggressively. Then came the cuffs, slammed too tight, the face he made while doing it, his condescension, the escalation that never needed to happen. When the video ended, the silence was complete. Judge Harmon leaned forward, hands together. "Sergeant Slater, you ignored established protocol, used excessive force, and intentionally left out critical moments from your report." Slater barely opened his mouth when the judge raised his hand. "All charges against Ms. Reed are dropped," Harmon said, voice firm. He brought down the gavel. "And I recommend immediate internal review of Sergeant Slater's actions." The tension in the courtroom snapped like a stretched rope finally giving way. It was immediate. A quiet hum of reactions stirred, some surprised, some satisfied, but not a single sound came from Sergeant Darren Slater. His face had turned a deep shade of red, his jaw tight, fists clenched so hard at his sides, his knuckles looked pale. He stood frozen for a beat, like someone trying to absorb a hit that had landed harder than expected. Juliana Reed exhaled slowly, balanced and calm. She reached down, collected her folder and blazer from the chair without a rush. There was no sense of victory in her face, only the kind of clarity that came with truth finally surfacing. Before turning to leave, she looked over her shoulder at Slater one last time. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Her silence was the statement, and in that moment it said everything. Now he was the one exposed. Now his reputation, so carefully polished, needed explaining. Without warning, Slater turned and left in a hurry, the sharp slap of his shoes echoing down the marble hallway. He didn't wait to speak with anyone, didn't stop to argue. He brushed past benches and door frames with a stiff, mechanical urgency, every step betraying the nerves he tried to hide. People watched him go. Other officers, courthouse workers, even a few reporters who had caught wind of the case and slipped. Inside, during the second half, their eyes followed him like they'd just seen a different version of the man they thought they knew. It was new territory for him. He had spent years walking through buildings like this and being treated as someone in charge. He expected deference, sometimes even fear. But now there were only sideways glances, quiet comments, and an unmistakable shift in how the air felt around him. He had almost made it to the building's main doors when he heard it. Sergeant Slater. The voice was sharp, cutting through the muffled hallway sounds like a bell. He stopped, turned. Standing near the entrance was Chief Arnold Denton, arms folded tight. The man had been with the Baltimore Police Department for well over 3 decades. People respected Denton not out of fear, but because he'd earned it, and today his eyes said everything Slater didn't want to hear. Darren Slater stiffened his back instinctively. "Sir?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. "Chief." Arnold Denton didn't respond right away. He just looked at Slater the way a father might look at a kid who burned down the shed, disappointed, frustrated, but mostly just tired. Finally, he gave a small nod and motioned toward a side door. "Come with me." They slipped into a small office just off the hallway, the kind of room used for quiet conversations that nobody wanted in the official record. The door shut behind them with a flat click, and Denton's whole manner shifted. The calm posture dropped instantly. "What the hell were you thinking?" Slater let out a shallow breath, wordless for a moment. "I was doing my job," he said finally, voice more defensive than confident. Denton's laugh was short and sharp. He grabbed a thick folder from a nearby shelf and tossed it onto the desk. It landed heavy, pages sliding slightly forward. "That's not what the evidence shows. Body cam footage, the long list of traffic stops, and the fact that you didn't even bother checking who you were detaining. You seriously didn't run her name through the system?" Slater's nostrils flared. "How's that relevant?" Denton leaned in, tone cold but controlled. "Because she's not just a random motorist, she's a decorated officer in the Navy, a full commander. Did you really think cuffing and booking someone like that without cause, on camera, was going to stay quiet?" Slater's mouth twisted. "She disrespected me. She acted like I didn't have authority." "That's not illegal," Denton said, cutting him off. "You don't get it," Slater snapped, shaking his head. "People like that?" Denton's eyes narrowed, his voice dropped. "People like what?" Slater hesitated. His jaw moved like he was about to say something, then it locked. He stayed silent, staring toward the window. Denton watched him for a second longer, then sat down heavily, rubbing his forehead with one hand. "The district attorney's office is already reviewing everything. Every stop, every case. 5 years worth." He looked up. "You've been flagged for potential bias. If even a fraction of it holds up, we're not protecting you. This department can't afford it." Slater felt his stomach turn. "What does that mean exactly?" Denton stood. "It means you're suspended right now. Internal Affairs is digging into this, and if what they find matches what I've seen," he shook his head slowly, "you're done." The words hit Darren Slater harder than anything during his years on the force. "Your career is finished." It rang in his head like an echo he couldn't shut off. His face burned with heat, a flush rising up his neck. He opened his mouth, ready to fire back. Something about this being unfair, about political pressure, or how the department never backed him. "This is ridiculous." Chief Denton lifted his hand, palm out. "Don't finish that sentence." His voice dropped lower, sharp and final. "Just clear your desk, and if you're smart, get yourself a lawyer." Slater didn't move. He just stood there, fists locked by his sides, like if he squeezed hard enough, he could hold on to whatever control was slipping away. That uniform used to mean something to him. Respect, order, authority. But now, in this small room with a file of facts stacked against him and no defense that held water, the badge felt a little heavier than usual. For the first time he could remember in all his years of giving orders, writing reports, and deciding who got let go with a warning and who spent the night in a holding cell, it hit him. He wasn't untouchable. He had never truly considered that his actions might come back on him, but they had. Hard. Across the city, Juliana Reed sat at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop near Harbour East. She stirred her coffee absently, swiping through the latest news on her phone. She didn't react as the headline popped up: Navy officer wrongfully detained during routine stop, sergeant under internal investigation. The article was already spreading. Local outlets had picked it up fast. She took a slow sip, calm as ever. Nothing in the report surprised her. She had known from the very beginning, when the red and blue lights flared behind her, when the officer approached with that expression, the one that said, "I've already decided who you are," exactly where that night would go. She'd seen this pattern before. Different cities, different uniforms, same attitude. Some officers got too comfortable twisting the rules, acting like accountability was for everyone else. But this time, it didn't work. Slater had pushed too far, and the truth had made its way to the surface. And for Juliana, that was enough for now. Juliana glanced down at her phone as it buzzed across the cafe table. A message lit up the screen from her attorney, Meredith. Joe, Slater's been officially suspended. No word yet on formal charges, but it's leaning that way. Juliana took another slow sip from her cup. Good, she said quietly to herself, the word falling more like a breath than a declaration. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The truth was, none of this had ever been about revenge. It was about being seen, being heard, and holding someone accountable for crossing a line they thought didn't matter. She looked out the window. Across the street, someone struggled to fold up a wet umbrella. A delivery guy pushed a handcart stacked with boxes through puddles. Life outside carried on just as it always did, rain or shine. People moved, worked, hustled, joked around. The world didn't pause to notice one woman sitting at a quiet table after a difficult week. But Juliana didn't need it to. She noticed. And that was enough. This win wasn't just hers. It was for the other people Darren Slater had likely singled out, the ones who didn't have cameras recording, or attorneys on standby, or anyone to listen to their version of events. She thought about how many times situations like hers got buried or brushed aside. But not today. Today had gone differently. And that mattered. Outside, the sidewalk was drying under scattered patches of sunlight cracking through the clouds. The smell of damp pavement hung in the air, mixed with the scent of brewed coffee drifting from shop doors left half open. Juliana tossed her empty cup in the bin and stepped out, fixing her collar as she walked into the afternoon. The usual weight that came with being aware of how she was seen, aware of every assumption, was still there, but lighter somehow. Her steps were calm but steady, like she wasn't walking away from anything, just forward. Then her phone buzzed again. She pulled it from her jacket pocket and paused when she saw the number. It wasn't marked, but she recognized it. A sigh escaped her lips, soft but telling. She answered, voice even. "Hello?" "Commander Reed," came the familiar voice on the line, calm but pointed. "I assume you've seen the news coverage?" Juliana Reed kept her eyes on the crosswalk ahead as she answered. "I have." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a more careful question. "How are you feeling?" She caught her own reflection in the glass of a pharmacy window as she waited for the light to change. Her posture was upright, shoulders back, no trace of stress, no cracks showing. She thought about everything that had happened in the last 72 hours, the arrest, the courtroom, the footage. It should have worn her down, but standing there, she didn't feel smaller. She felt solid. "I feel like I did what I was supposed to do," she said plainly. The voice on the line softened just slightly. Captain Marcus Elliot, head of her division, someone she had trusted for years. That's exactly what I expected to hear. Another small pause, then his tone shifted. Look, I should tell you, Public Affairs from the Pentagon reached out. There's growing interest in your situation. You might get asked to speak about it openly, maybe even sit for an interview. Juliana breathed through her nose, more thoughtful than surprised. I didn't do this to become some kind of headline. You are one, Elliot replied, quickly, and whether you meant to or not, you've become part of something bigger. What happened to you? What you stood up against? It's a flashpoint now. She knew he was right. Juliana leaned her shoulder against a nearby lamppost, watching cars weave through traffic and pedestrians waiting for green lights. The city hadn't changed. Sirens still wailed in the distance. Someone on the corner laughed too loud on a phone call. But something had shifted, even if just slightly, for her and for what her story represented. Slater wasn't unusual, she said quietly. Guys like him are out there every day. What happened to me? It's not new, and it won't stop with him. No, Elliot said, but for the first time, he's the one facing the fallout, because you didn't back down. Juliana nodded. Into the phone, her gaze steady on the passing crowd. I had the tools. Others don't. That's why they need you to step forward, he added. I'll think about it, she said, and she meant it. Juliana closed her eyes just long enough to let the weight of the captain's words settle. She had stood her ground, all the way back to that humid Thursday night when she was pulled over for no reason at all. She hadn't caved when Darren Slater raised his voice, or when the cuffs clicked tight against her skin. Even when she sat in that holding cell for hours, knowing full well the odds weren't stacked in her favor, she didn't back down. She just waited, trusting that the truth would carry forward even if it had to crawl. Now, here she was, weeks later, her name cleared, his under review. On the other end of the line, Captain Elliot cleared his throat. One more thing before I let you go, he said. You're probably going to hear from someone in the mayor's office. Juliana raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Really? They want to thank you. Something about how professionally you handled the whole situation. She couldn't help but let out a dry chuckle. That's almost funny, considering how unprofessional the situation was to begin with. True, the captain said with a low laugh. Still, they're reaching out. Will you take the call? She thought about it for a quick second. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to say she didn't need a pat on the back from the same leadership that hadn't said a word before now. But she also understood moments like these held weight, and silence often got mistaken for agreement. She shrugged. I'll think about it. She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her coat pocket. Across the street, she noticed a woman walking with a young boy, probably no older than 4. The kid's tiny hand was wrapped tightly in his mom's, and he burst out laughing at something she said. Juliana's gaze followed them as they made their way through the crowd. Children like him, curious, wide-eyed, still untouched by how harsh the world could be, deserved better than what she had faced. That's why she stood up when it mattered. Not just for herself, but for him, and for anyone who didn't have the chance to. She walked on, her steps steady and full of intent, because this was never just about one bad arrest or one corrupt officer. It was about power unchecked, and the damage it could do. And if telling this story causes even one conversation, sparks even one shift in mindset, then it's worth repeating, again and again.